So without further ado, let's begin with a talk from Heidi Richards. Heidi, over to you.
Okay, great. I thought I'd use a nice snowy background since it's a Christmas lecture. So thank you again, Richard, for the opportunity to speak. I'm currently finishing my PhD in the Department of Archaeology at Durham University, supervised by Pam Graves and Chris Gerard. So my talk today is titled The Real Knights of the Round Table, and this comes from a case study which is part of my thesis. My research explores the influences from medieval romance literature and Arthurian themes within medieval castle architecture, or specifically English castles. And I take my perspective from buildings archaeology, researching architectural features and trends in secular elite architecture and their associated landscapes. And through this, I identify themes and influences from the Romance tradition. So, as I said, this talk is taken from one of my case studies, which will focus on Pendragon Castle. But before I jump into this particular case study, I'll just briefly give sort of a 3-minute thesis summation of my work to set the context. I'll just let this slide sit here, looking pretty with the castles. Right. So the idea that Romance literature impacted the architecture of castles is becoming more prevalent, though it's still met with some hesitancy, and that's due to several reasons, but primarily it's due to the inability to prove intangible motives behind designs from 800 plus years ago. So however, in my thesis, I discuss ways that this idea can be broken down and assessed in smaller subsections, which can be used to build a wider context of the cultural impact that Romance definitely did have among the elite and their ideals, ultimately recognizing this footprint which was left in the built environment. So to build the cultural context of Romantic influence, I look first at medieval Romance and its place in elite society. So through book ownership, commissions, and wills, romances were owned and circulated by the uppermost elite. One of the more well-known case studies of this was, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Roger Sherman Loomis's discussion of Edward I's Arthurian enthusiasm, in which he discusses Edward's use of Arthurian relics, which were used in ceremonies and round table tournaments, with specifically Arthurian theatrics. And I believe this was used to legitimize his power and conquest of Wales and Scotland. So this was readdressed again in the study by Richard Morris, and then again with Edward III by Richard Barber. So Edward III's Round Table at Windsor by Mumby, Barber and Brown from 2007 is another well-known study where archaeology is used, along with documentation, to build the wider context of Edward III's use of Arthurian propaganda and the construction of this massive circular structure in Windsor Castle's quadrangle. So the structure was never finished and masonry was robbed out, but through the excavation and historical documentation, that's been assessed, and it's really exciting. So Geoffrey of Monmouth is a huge character in my thesis, and his Historia Regum Britanniae was written around about 1135, and it's a pseudo-historical ancestral narrative mapping the ancestors of the kings of Britain. And this was later reproduced by Wace, or Was, however you want to pronounce it, in 1155 in his Roman de Bru from a Norman perspective, which people believe that was commissioned by Henry II. And then finally, again, by Layamond's Brut Chronicle, which in 1270, or in the 1270s, brought this into a specifically English context. So rather than Arthur and Constantine and Hengist and Horsa and Vortigern and all these great characters from the British ancestry, now it was specifically English. So I identify Romance's impact in two different ways. Firstly, by identifying individual instances of Romantic influence at a feature-by-feature level. And this is done by exploring the wider socio-political and geographical context of the castle and its owner. And secondly, by identifying Romance's impact through chivalry and chivalric values, by exploring ways that romance influenced chivalric values, which were then constructed into architecture. 13th and 14th century handbooks of chivalry actually take specific ideals from romances, primarily the prose Lancelot in the late 13th century, which modeled upon the chivalric lady and activities in court, such as recounting quests and how one should behave around a lady and how the lady should present herself, using the Lady of the Lake and Guinevere as examples. So I've used Anthony Giddens's theory of structuration to develop my own idea of chivalric structuration, in which chivalric values and activities determined the uses of space and also required specific spaces in which to exist. So sort of taking meaning from space, but also applying meaning to space, or defining and being defined by it. So an obvious example of this would be a tilt yard, constructed for and defined by the chivalric ideals around the joust. So in researching previous claims of chivalric or romantic castles, there's rarely an explanation as to how or what is meant by the term romantic and what it actually looks like applied within castle features. So chivalric could either be used in place of describing a castle as ornate or fortified, but what about courtly love and largesse and charity? So I'm examined specific values of chivalry found within spaces of the castle and features of the castle. And chivalry is further made complicated by ideas that it was only applicable to the martial class. When we have direct evidence that chivalry became the aspiration for the entire aristocracy, which included women and non-martial men, which can be seen in Ramon Lull's Handbook of Chivalry from about 1273. And he was a member of clergy and writing a handbook on chivalry within this contemporary society. So it's just really, really interesting study of how the knights were the chivalric class, and then that changed into the entire nobility, which branched to chivalric ladies and chivalric men who had nothing to do with fighting. So building upon these romantically reformed values of pedestrian or lay chivalry, I'll call it, chivalric structuration then becomes a conduit for romantic influence, which includes nuanced focuses of the agency of the lady and spaces and features of conspicuous privacy, which is a term I've taken from Rachel Delman's work on Tudor castles, this idea of privacy that was meant to be seen to portray an image. And so to identify chivalric structuration in castles, I used the Hillier and Hanson method of access analysis in a comparative study of different categories of English castles, not regionally specific, spanning the medieval period. So I realize at this point I should address the elephant in the room by bringing up the age-old question, what defines a castle? So this is where I'm going to get a bit controversial, and I apologize. I'll argue that all of the above is a castle. So whether we mean peel towers, hunting retreats, palaces, fortresses, and this is based on my study of historical etymologies and evidence that shows that contemporaries refer to their architecture without adhering to specific standards of palace versus fortification, and using terms quite interchangeably. So, for example, in a moment, I'll be focusing on Pendragon Castle, and it didn't have a license to crenellate until 1309, though it was listed as a castle in the Calendar of Inquisitions post-mortem in 1284. However, in the Gough map, which I'll also show and talk about more in a moment, it dates from about 1370, but Pendragon Castle was not portrayed in the same manner as other castles, and it's been referred to as a peel tower or a hunting retreat. So there's a lot of confusion based on what actually is a castle here. So it was not portrayed in the same manner in the 1370s, and I mean, when I discuss this in a moment, sorry, it just seems like it was almost a Norman folly by this time even. So we have this medieval sort of archaism, which, as the slide shows, I'll get to this in one second. So another site, which is Clarendon Palace, it was a seat of justice and used as a judicial castle, similar to Winchester, though the architecture follows our idea of a palace, and yet some claim that it was an elite hunting lodge. So this idea of architectural nostalgia or archaism, as you see on this slide here, it's a means of constructing memory through legitimizing power through ancestral heritage. In my thesis, I use architectural archaism as a means of chivalric nostalgia to construct the memory in the built environment. So this memory of a legitimized, powerful ancestry. The Normans were notorious for assimilating their conquered local heritage and architectural styles, which is also seen in their conquest of Sicily and Ireland and the architecture afterwards. So the ground floor hall is one of the primary elements that I've discussed in my thesis, which was reused by the Normans in a way to legitimize their authority within the landscape. So basically in France, the ground floor hall was a lower class market or barn context, and it wasn't this royal grand display. So taking influence from the great hall culture before the conquest, I argue that the Great Hall was probably one of the original constant features of the English castle, when most other features were taken from several different castle cultures around the continent. And this was specifically to present an image of the English kings as supranational powers rather than previous insular powers. So this archaism, which is crucial for my Pendragon case study, there's this idea of the cult castle, and with access analysis, looking at the inside of the castle, I've looked at how updated privacy measures and personal chambers were included in Bodiam Castle, for example, but the outside exterior of the structure can be compared to castles from a century previously. And there's Norman reconstructions of ground floor halls, such as Caen Castle, when Henry I went over the channel and built a huge, I argue that it was a ground floor hall at Caen, as a way of kind of combining this new supranational power and showing the Englishness of it. So Pendragon remained archaic in the style that it was built, and especially when compared to Brougham, or I say Brougham, but it's probably Broome, I think, which gained lodgings in the new curtain wall and gatehouse, which was a contemporary architectural trend, which also is reflected in John of Gaunt's building works at Kenilworth, seen in the bottom picture there. So that's the more contemporary style at this point. But it remained sort of almost a folly, as I've said. So first of all, I need to turn to Edward I Arthurian enthusiasm, revisited. So Edward I was indeed an enthusiast of King Arthur. And when I say Arthur, I'm combining the legend tradition with the romance tradition, because they were all kind of one amalgamation through Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, and that was used to base the romance tradition off of. So Edward held round tables at Kenilworth, or Nevin Castle, not Nevin Castle, I apologize, Nevin wasn't a castle. It was just a significant place where prophecies of Merlin were claimed to be found. Westminster, and that was where he commissioned the round table, which is still hanging in the Great Hall. He received Arthur's crown as a relic at the Nevin Round Table to celebrate this Welsh victory. And so Nevin is significant as the site that Gerald of Wales claimed to find the prophecies of Merlin. And this included the red and white dragon prophecy, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where the red dragon signified Wales, and how it would be defeated. It originally stood for Britain, but since Laymon's Chronicle Brut in 1270, Britain turned into, well, all of England. It became an English perspective rather than a British perspective, and Wales was the loser as Red Dragon in this case. So his round tables were at Arthurian specific locations and had super theatrical aspects to them. So another bit of Edward's enthusiasm can be seen in his land claim in Scotland. Basically, I know this is a lot of text, but in Close Rolls also, which was published in Stone's 1965 work, he wrote a letter to the Pope trying to claim land in Scotland based off of his Arthurian heritage and how leaders in Scotland had to pay fealty to Arthur. So the bold bit is the important stuff. So Arthur, king of the Britons, a prince most renowned, subjected himself to a rebellious Scotland, destroyed Angus by name. Afterwards, when King Arthur held a most famous feast at Caerleon, there were present all of the kings subject to him, and among them Angus, king of Scotland, who manifested the service due for the realm of Scotland by nearing the sword of King Arthur before him. And in succession, all the kings of Scotland have been subject to all the kings of the Britons, and it goes on for pages. So this is what Edward was using to say that he claimed land, and the Pope was like, no, doesn't quite work that way, but he tried. So La mort d'Edward, Edward I's death. At his death, he had some of his closest magnates there. Robert Clifford was one of them, which is really important because Robert Clifford inherited Pendragon Castle and is the one who gave it the name. So this is just an excerpt from Peter Langtoft's Chronicle in 1307, which is just praising the chivalry of Edward and comparing it to Arthur, calling him even the flower of Christendom, which is how Arthur and Gawain were described. So after Edward I's death, Edward II started okay. Robert Clifford was one of the ones who was sort of tasked with helping him begin his rule. So he developed his favorite, Piers Gaveston, among other things, which included not participating in tournaments like other kings had, or enjoying being in the garden, or enjoying working in the garden specifically like a female would do. And so this starkly non-chivalric rule style that he had really contradicted what just was previously his father's rule. So it caused a lot of unrest by the closest magnates to Edward I. I apologize that this image is quite blurry and faded. It's just an image from Peter Langtoft's Chronicle of England where Edward II is receiving the crown, but the Latin has been scratched out, and the French sort of rhyme, I guess, was replacing it, and it says, "I am the tumble-down king, and all the world mocks me." So, yeah, it speaks for itself. Right. So, unrest grew. The magnates got really unhappy, and it was these specific ones that were going to be crucial for Piers Gaveston's trial and his execution, as well as leading this rebellion sort of against Edward II. So there were some treasonous letters back and forth between James Douglas in Scotland and these magnates. So Edward II got wind of them and then sent them to Bishop, and it got published, and wanted everyone to see this example of treason. So in this excerpt from the Close Rolls, certain magnates of the realm have for a long time disturbed the king and his realm, proclaiming that they did all these things for the honor and profit of the king, and have now taken to arms and gone to the north, and have leagued themselves against the king with Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. So he knows that Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, is kind of leading this rebellion. And that's really important because the next one we see here, the transcript of a letter closed under the seal of Sir James Douglas, entitled at the tail to King Arthur. So now we have the leader of this rebellion is kind of as a secret code being called or referred to as King Arthur now. And I apologize that this is a lot of text as well. From Edward II's Close Rolls, he published this letter as well, which is from what people think was from Thomas Lancaster, as he was the host at Pontefract Castle. He owned Pontefract Castle after inheriting it from Henry de Lacy. So this is just basically saying this is why we know that Thomas of Lancaster was this King Arthur that James Douglas referred to. And the people involved in this rebellion are listed in correspondence from the Calendar of Close Rolls, Edward II, Vita Edwardi Secundi, the Ruse Roll, and the Wigmore Brute Chronicle, which lists these magnates which were reportedly ready for action in this excerpt here, which includes Roger Clifford and the Earl of Hereford, which Humphrey de Bohun, sorry. So going back to Pendragon, I'm sure it's obvious why I've selected Pendragon Castle as a case study for Arthurian influence. And just to clarify, once again, Arthurian influence, I include Arthur's character in the Romance tradition as a passive but greatly reputed chivalric king, as well as his local folkloric traditions as he appears in much older legends. So the first mention that I've been able to find of Pendragon before it was called Pendragon is from the postmortem inquest of Edward I in his 12th year. The important bit is underlined and italicized, Mallerstang the castle. They call it castle. It's not called Pendragon. It's just basically the castle of Mallerstang at this point. So Robert Clifford inherits Pendragon and Brougham and the estates of Appleby in Westmoreland. And so he carries out significant building works at Brougham to host Edward I's visit in 1300. And at the same time, he's kind of refurbished Pendragon as well. But the red here on the screen just shows the extent of building works at Brougham compared to Pendragon, which basically got a guard robe and that's it. They've got a loo for Edward's visit. And so the keep at Brougham got extended. It got increased by 2 more floors. It got a huge curtain wall. The southwest tower, it got a curtain wall with lodgings and a double gatehouse. And I'm inferring that Robert Clifford really kind of holds these castles together almost. The best way to say it, I'm not sure. He got them licensed to crenellate at the same time in 1309. And he did their building works simultaneously for Edward I's visit. So if Brougham was going to be hosting Edward I, then Pendragon Castle, I'm not sure, up in the air, basically, still working on that. So it was attacked by Scots twice in the late 14th century, but then the next documentation we can't really find much more documentation until Anne Clifford's diary in 1670. And so it remained a small 12th century style tower. Anne Clifford's works in the sort of, I guess, in the Bailey as such, are only seen in sort of crop markings now, which they don't exist. So all that's there is just a bit of the ruined keep. But these ancillary buildings, there might have been 14th century before the 17th century buildings of Anne Clifford, but the archaeology is just, it's not there yet. So it just remained this small sort of archaic style tower, basically. And here on the Gulf map, we have Stainmore, Westmoreland, and so you can just see how contemporaries are visualizing their architecture, basically. So Shap Abbey, you can see that these ecclesiastical buildings have the steeple, but Appleby Castle and Brougham Castle have a crenellated tower, whereas Pendragon does not. So this baronial unrest, Humphrey de Bohun was a big player as well. And the Swan Knight starts coming up in the Dunstable roll of arms. The magnates who opposed Edward II and were leading the retinues for this tournament in the Dunstable tournament. And also Robert de Tony was dressed as the Swan Knight, leader of one of the retinues at the tournament, and then the Dunstable Jewel. So the Swan Knight becomes really sort of a prominent symbol, and the Swan Knight was an Arthurian knight. So now we have the bow and swan, which was used the first time as a crest on the Baron's letter, which is sort of backing Edward I up with his land claim in Scotland. And then we have Robert Clifford's renaming Pendragon Castle by obtaining the license to crenellate. And so it was important. Brougham Castle was an important site along the Stainmore Pass. So if Edward II, I argue in my thesis that if Edward II was against all of these Arthurian themes cropping up sort of in this rebellion, it would be awkward to refuse Pendragon Castle's crenellation if it's at the same time as Brougham Castle's crenellation. So we move to Piers Gaveston's trial at Warwick. Once again, we see the same barons popping up. So Guy Beauchamp, Humphrey de Bohun, Thomas Plantagenet, Thomas of Lancaster, who is King Arthur. The important thing here is Arthur pops up again, because in the Ruse Roll, which this is an 1845 copy of an image of, there's Guy Beauchamp with the decapitated Piers Gaveston underneath, and his son Thomas with the Swan Knight, the cup, which is a relic of the Swan Knight, pictured under him there on the right. So the important bit of this to take away from this is basically below Guy's image in the original. It says, it accuses Gaveston of selling out of the land the round table of silver that was King Arthur's and the trestles. So they've accused Gaveston of this horrific national crime of selling out of the land King Arthur's round table. And this is a lot. I appreciate that is a whole lot. But it's a chart I made for my research, just showing that basically these are all the key players, and this is how they were related to Edward I, close to Edward I. And basically what they've done that's Arthurian, which is against Edward II. So this takes us to the Knights of the Round Table. And as my talk is titled, The Real Knights of the Round Table, with all of these Arthurian themes cropping up, we have Thomas Plantagenet. He was the King Arthur as a pseudonym. Robert Clifford, he was within Edward I's Arthurian sort of cult of Arthur inner circle, and he renovated Brougham and Pendragon for Edward I's visit, and then it was named Pendragon Castle. And then you have Guy Beauchamp, and he had Guy of Warwick was written for him essentially as an ancestral romance, and he had Swan Knight relics as well, but he accused Piers Gaveston of stealing the round table before he was executed. Henry de Lacy commissioned a version of the Brute, which is one of the pseudo-histories relating the ancestry to Geoffrey of Monmouth, Wace, Layman. They all sort of keep weaving this Arthurian ancestry through the English nobility. And so he commissioned one of those as well. Humphrey de Bohun in the Wigmore Brute Chronicle, he's also described as the flower of chivalry. And he emblemized the Bohun swan, used first in Edward I Scottish land claim, which was based on Arthurian inheritance. So yeah, and then Roger Mortimer, obviously against Edward II. He is one of the probable commissioners of the Wigmore Chronicle, which justify the Mortimer claim to the throne. So what this means, wrapping up Arthurian castles. So this is demonstrated one means of identifying, assessing Arthur's architectural impact. And this is through the archaism, specifically of Pendragon Castle, which is, it's kept its deliberate style, archaic style, as a means of creating this memory of Arthurian heritage in England. and named and structured as part of a wider effort to mobilize Arthur as a symbol of unification against Edward II's distinctly non-chivalrous reign. So I only pieced this Arthurian rebellion at the end of my thesis research. So as I'm now just finalizing my edits, I'm unable to go further into this for my thesis as I would like. But all of the knights mentioned were connected through the shared Arthurian ties, and Pendragon's one example through its name and archaic style. But there's so much potential for future research, specifically into the other magnates and Pontefract Castle, where Thomas was hiding out with all of these barons, and the Bohun castles and Mortimer connections as well. So the ground is so ripe for this new research within the continued cult of Arthur, just mobilizing Arthur's name through architecture, through relics, through pseudonyms and everything like that. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. And yeah, they seem to really like Arthur. Unsurprising, I suppose, really. Right. So, Heidi, if you're able to stop screen sharing. Next up, we have Arthur Redmonds, who will be talking about taskscapes. So, Arthur, let's take a moment to start screen sharing, and then we'll get underway.
Right. I guess I'll start then. So I'm going to start this presentation with a slight warning. So in 1994, Chris Godson and Leslie Head asserted that notions of landscape are utilised for their ambiguity above anything else. So talking about taskscapes, it's a landscape term. It's an almost ambiguous term. It's quite difficult to pin down. I'm going to do my best, as best I can in 20 minutes. But if you've got any questions afterwards, feel free to message me, or I can leave my email in the chat if people want to, if that can't get into the questions. So the term taskscape was brought to attention in Tim Ingold's 1993, The Temporality of the Landscape. And for the purpose of my research, it allows me to explore how disparate evidence of the medieval landscape helps reconstruct the experience of living around the medieval castle. So taskscapes concentrate on exploring the interrelationships in the landscape through exploring the tasks that give the concept its name. And most importantly, explores the temporality of the landscape, which derives from the pattern of these tasks or dwelling activities. So tasks are the acts and processes associated with just living in the landscape. And through living, you generate meaning. Through performing tasks, through performing your labor, you generate a sense of identity or community within that landscape, derived from social time, which is just the temporality of these tasks, so the different scales of time. So Ingold was inspired by Peter Bruegel the Elder's The Harvesters. That was one of his first inspirations to come up with taskscape, and I've included it here because it's a good example of what we mean by taskscape. So he used it to explain holisticity and interrelationships that lie at the heart of the taskscape. And if we look at the Harvesters, we've got our farming going on, we've got church in the background, we've got men sleeping, we've got people eating, and Ingold himself explored taskscapes as the temporality of the landscapes, from scales of analysis shifting from the flows of the streams to the pathways that you can see through the middle of the painting, and the loud snores and the slurps of the drinker. So it includes essentially every act of living within that landscape and exploring what that means for identity. So recently, the taskscape has seen a resurgence as a term after it was created in 1993. And I'll give you two of my favourite examples. The first is Ryan Lash's 2018 Pebbles and Peregrinato, which looked at an Irish medieval monastic landscape. So we can see these pebbles on the right-hand side. And he was exploring how the waves, so the natural world, the natural taskscape, was kind of rounding these pebbles, and how that related to ideas of Irish monasticism. So especially like the people setting out on the boats in the water, and the religious significance of water and how it was shaping the physical landscape, and how they utilised these pebbles across their monastic landscape. Another good one is Robertson and Webber's 2017 anthropological study, The People of the Croft, and that looks at how tasks of crofting generated identity and memory. So this man in the bottom right-hand corner was asked to take a photograph of what summed up his croft to him, and for him a croft was sheep raising. So we can see how his notion of landscape has been defined by the tasks he performed within it. His idea of the croft is sheep raising, and that's important to him. So for the aims of my own research, I'll be looking to use this theoretical framework of the taskscape, looking at how tasks within a landscape define identity, to explore, I've just said it, identity, memory, and social order amongst the communities associated with castles. So, especially within castle studies, there's been a lot of people that noticed recently, so Karen Dempsey in 2019 noted that there's been a critical absence, the micro scale of everyday life amongst castle studies, so this is a feminist critique. And through using taskscape and looking at these everyday tasks, I can achieve the aims of my own research and kind of correct this absence of everyday life within the wider castle studies. So I guess the bit we've all been waiting for, we get into the castles now. So I've looked at one continuous landscape. This is the Wigmore Basin in Herefordshire, northeast Herefordshire. It's hard to see from this little map, just on the Welsh border. So this is Wigmore Castle, Pypaston Castle, and Downton the Rock Castle. All these little blue areas are areas of medieval settlement. We have a nice Watling Street going through there. This area has been occupied continuously, as far as we know. The best evidence, early evidence, is Roman. That's Lentmore Dean, which was a Roman fortified settlement. There's multiple forts around here. And it provides a perfect example, because I can study all of these three castles as one case study and look at how the form of the castle changes how they relate to the tasks going on around it. So the first of the castles is Wigmore, the largest of the castles. So founded soon after the conquest by William Fitz-Osborne, really early castle in Herefordshire, fell into Mortimer hands by 1075 and remained their key castle until the early 1300s. So we saw the Mortimers in the last presentation, and this is where they were based until they moved to nearby Dudley. Now it's set within quite an extensive design landscape. There are multiple parks around it. There is what looks to be a pleasance, which has been unnoticed within previous scholarship, and it's only just been recently recorded by the Historical Environment Survey, a Historical Environment Record. And it was designed amongst this kind of watery landscape on one side, which it would be over here. There used to be a lake here. That's been farmed out of existence, and there was water down here. So we had this large design landscape going on around it, and there's a settlement just down here. There's so much going on that people can ask for the slides afterwards. I will be more than happy to provide. This is a rough timeline of what was going on at the castle. So you can see there's a lot of building work. For instance, we've got from here to here, it's a wooden castle just at the start. But as we can see, this is construction, this is construction. There's a lot of building work was going on all the way until about 1325. After that, it appears to have been less important, and some antiquarians appear to have just visited mercilessly in the 1520s and 1530s just to tell us how ruined it was and how rubbish it was, at which point it was being used as a prison. So this was kind of the Mortimer homeland. This is where they ruled the nearby area. The second of our castles is Downton on the Rock. So this is a very small castle, 12 meters wide and 13.5 meters tall. Be a very strange, like very tall thing. 3.5 meters tall. There's possible remains of a bailey around it, but I can't see those on the LiDAR. I'm not sure where people are saying those are coming from, but it's quite possible there was a bailey. And it held an octagonal stone tower at some point. This belonged to one of the Mortimer vassals, Downton on the Rock, the settlement. So this was presumably one of their castles, although we're not entirely sure what date when it dates from. However, around Wigmore Castle, there are 11 castles that belong to Mortimer vassals, compared to only 3 that belong to the Mortimers themselves in the area. And it appears to have been a concerted defensive effort. Most of these castles were to the north. So if I go back to the map, most of these castles were on this kind of northern area here. There's a few more up here. And it appears to have been an effort to almost defend Wigmore from Welsh raiders and other various noble families they had feuds with up north. So we're imagining it could be very early. It could be from about 1075 to 1200 is when this was occupied. And the octagonal stonework suggests it was occupied for a little longer. There was certainly a lot of effort put into it. So the third castle, the last castle, is Pypaston. So this is larger than Downton on the Rock, 35 meters in diameter, 6 meters high. It has a very large moat, and it contains stonework much like Downton on the Rock. Now, the complicating factor of Pypaston is that there is actually a second castle there. So what the relationship between these two is, again, we have no documentary evidence, so we're not entirely sure. But this second castle, so this is the main castle here, Pypaston 1. This is our second castle up here. It has no stonework. It has a bailey, but it appears to be completely unfinished. Now, it was either an anarchy-era siege work for this first castle, and the Mortimers, so Wigmore Castle's over here, the Mortimers were fighting the people who lived in Ludlow, so Jos Dino, which was over here. So it could have been that this was a siege castle dating to the anarchy as the two feuding families kept on fighting. Or it could just be, and this is the interpretation I prefer, as there's no stonework there, it appears to be unfinished. It could just be a precursor to the Pypaston 1, which is the main one for this study, a precursor castle which never finished, and they've moved into Pypaston 1. And unfortunately, this is the best picture I can get of it. So a mound, not that isn't good, I like a good mound. So now it's time to get on to how I've mapped these taskscapes. So these examples are from my master's dissertation, or a pilot study for my PhD research. So because taskscapes looks at all of the kind of tasks that are taking place around these castles, you can integrate a massive amount of evidence. So for instance, I use the portable antiquity scheme evidence to look at the kind of everyday activities that were occurring around the castle. So this is all the 233 artifacts that I found nearby, so in the parishes surrounding the three castles. And there were also excavation records from Wigmore Castle from 1996 and 1998 excavations which took place there as part of the conservation strategy. It's also important because taskscapes focus on temporality and the changing different scales of time to create a continuous landscape. So to make sure that every bit of the landscape is mapped in between. So I mapped out field systems, I mapped out any medieval settlements I could find to see how they related to the castles. And for that, I used satellite imagery and LiDAR to make sure I got everything mapped out. And I've got some examples on the next slide of what you can see with the LiDAR. So this first example here is Wigmore Castle. This is surrounding Wigmore Castle. And originally, this was a tournament ground here, we believe, between these two large banks. And this is where they held some of their Arthurian tournaments. And in fact, they built a round table here, which was taken to the Royal Palace at Woodstock. So they were big fans of their tournaments. But looking at the LiDAR, we can see new evidence all the time. So previously, it was thought that the deer park went to about here, and then matched these banks here and went through this little stream. So across this large hilly area here called the Wigmore Rolls. But I would suggest that this marks the upper boundary of it, which hasn't been previously recorded, a large ditch with a bank on the outside, which seems to match other deer park earthworks. And this is just a crop mark at this point, so it's not a modern creation. And on the right here, we have the Pleasance, the possible Pleasance. This is actually crossing a Roman road, so it's definitely after the Roman road. This bit here is modern, it's brickwork. The rest of this appears to be medieval, and it's quite close to the castle. It's within about 15 minutes walk. So that's the kind of evidence I'm using for these taskscapes. So how do I map them? Well, as temporality is like the key part of this, the key part of taskscapes, what I've done is I've mapped it using isochrones. So essentially, this tells me by giving a value to each piece of land, depending on how difficult it is to walk across, I can determine how far you can get in 15 minutes, half an hour. It's walking speed across the landscape. So these black lines are an hour, these white lines 15 minutes. So this is centered on the castle at Downton in the Rock. And this is how far you can get in the landscape in between them. So we can kind of ascertain a temporal proximity to the castle through walking speeds. The other way you can do this, so because we're looking at the act of dwelling, the act of living in the landscape, I've also done the sensory dimension. So I've done viewshed analysis. I know a lot of people do viewshed analysis, but it's the easiest one to do on ArcGIS, but I have tried to improve it somewhat. So this is the sensory dimension of life around the castles. These red areas are where you can see from Downton on the Rock Castle. And I've expanded this by looking at visual acuity, so the clarity of vision. So this green line is the foreground, and this yellow line is the edge of the middle ground. So Higuchi, a Japanese landscape geographer, argued for the existence of the foreground, the middle ground, and the foreground. So within this foreground, he used trees, deciduous woodland. Within this foreground, you can see the branches, you can see the leaves, you can see the full tree. Within the middle ground, you can see groups of trees. You can make out individual trees, but you can't make out finer details like branches and leaves. Beyond that, you just see masses of vegetation. So how this applies to taskscape studies is within this foreground, we have very clear visual acuity. We can see tasks going on, we can see the people, we can see the items they're using. It's very clear, there's a clear relationship between the people and the castle. There's intense clarity. In this middle ground, you can probably see evidence of tasks. So for instance, these yellow patches are field systems. These are all the ridge and furrow in the area. So you could see evidence of large-scale evidence of tasks, but you can't see individual people, you can't see tools. And I'll explain why seeing tools and seeing individual people is important later on. So to explore what taskscapes can tell us, I've got 3 examples. So I'm going to look at the agricultural elements of the taskscape, I'm going to look at the religious elements of the taskscape, and then I'm going to look at the elite elements of the taskscape, because we all like elite landscapes, we all like our horses. So the first of these, and probably my favourite, are the agricultural taskscapes. So all 3 of the castles in this area, Downton on the Rock, Pypaston and Wigmore, contain agricultural land within this visual foreground, so this green line here, and we can see these field systems around. I do apologise, the resolution appears to have been compressed. I'm not sure how that happened, but these are the field systems, these large yellow patches. So we can see that they're completely visible within the red areas, and they're within the foreground of the castle. So this allowed labourers in the fields to be clearly distinguished from the castle. And importantly, this kind of clarity of vision with regards to the performance of tools and tools of agriculture, tasks and items. These agricultural tasks and items held semiotic meaning, important to contemporary constructions of social order throughout. So for instance, we've got this on the right-hand side here. This is the chronicle of Florence of Worcester. And it's a record that John of Worcester made of Henry I having a dream about various people within society approaching him to demand his just overlordship. So we can see here, often medieval society was split into 3 orders. So we can see here the people that fight, the people that pray would be the church, but here are people that work, are farm labourers, they've got their farm implements. So the proximity and clarity of this kind of farmland around our castles allowed these semiotically charged farm tools to be kind of distinguished from the castle. And that tied the castle landscape into ideas of social order through the contrast with the military nobility of the castle, these people, those who fight. Within the castle, we have those who fight. Within the wider landscape, we have those who work. And those who work are overlooked by the castle. It's a clear marking of social order. And all 3 of these stone castles were built, what's this one? Within 15 minutes of plenty of farmland, even Wigmore, which has a larger design deer park around it, there's plenty of farmland within about 15 minutes. And it's important that the castles stand within these agricultural landscapes, because whilst the agricultural cycle and the seasons saw the fields changing hue and texture all the time, as we can see here, this change in texture over the seasons, the castle kind of stands amongst that, completely unchanging in texture and visually prominent from the work fields. As such, it ties itself into social memory and identity of the surrounding settlements, as it's an unchanging contrast to the continuously changing labour within the field and the settlement. Moreover, the castle, if we look at the excavation records from Wigmore, there is no agricultural equipment within it, which is a massive contrast to its hinterland. A contrast which also influenced communal ideas of identity and memory due to the centrality of the castle within these taskscapes. So as we can see in the last slide, centrality of it within the settlement and the wider farming landscape. Because people like Sally Smith in 2014 argue that children develop a perception of communal and private notions of space within the medieval village through play. And we know from psychological studies that children inherit social constructions and understanding by the age of 4. So growing up in this settlement, there'll be a clear, the castle stands out, it's distinguished amongst this agricultural landscape, it's very different, you understand your place in social order. So our second one are the religious taskscapes. So Tim Ingold in particular draws attention to churches. So the relationship between castles and religion within the taskscapes demonstrates that the sensory experience of the castle was embedded in the temporality of the community. And as such, social order became embedded in social memory, as cyclical religious rituals centered on founding a sense of community are constantly shaped by the presence of these castles. So churches in particular, we have our bells, we have our burial and memory of ancestors. They're an important center of the community. And one of the closest, most prominent relationships in all 3 of these castles is a close association between local churches and the castles. So all 3 castles are within at most 5 minutes walk of the church. In here we can see the church and the churchyard, and the castle is being got here at Downton on the Rock. And this relationship is important within the taskscape setting, as the church and churchyards, as I've just said, act in cultural and social centres of the medieval taskscape associated communities. And medieval archaeologists such as Hopcroft, Gilchrist, and Kevin French highlight how rituals such as churching or mass drew the community together. And indeed, they drew wider Christendom together. And the burial of ancestors, it creates a centre of memory within this landscape. So the fact that these were in the visual foreground that you can't see in this picture, but also incredibly close temporal proximity, shows that the castle was kind of embedding itself into the cycles of human life, and the rhythms which were centered on these churches. So it embedded itself within the social memory and identity of the community just through proximity and kind of towering over these churches and churchyards. There's also an alternative temporality. So if we look at churches and the ringing of the bells, that's important because it's a constant rhythm. It's a rhythm in everyone's life that they understand. But at Wigmore, we have an abbey up here, which also rang bells across the landscape, but was only accessible to the Mortimers. And we have records of the Mortimers actually listening to the bells and becoming religious, because that's apparently how religion works in a Herefordshire landscape. Just hear the bells, that's it, you're a great Christian. But this ultimate temporality, the ringing of the bells here and the ringing of bells in the church, marked a division between elite religion and the religion of the local settlements, which is important. It's another division in the landscape. Another way of ensuring social order is prominent. So I know we've just gone over 20 minutes, but just the last example here. So these are elite taskscapes. So Ingold in 2017, reflecting on his original idea of taskscape, noted that people it's too easy to just go for tasks, activity, doing stuff, but rest and leisure are incredibly important as well. And in the case of our castle taskscapes, these are really important in showing how there's a different relationship with the land between the elite communities and the more average everyday community. Well, I say everyday as if elite people don't live every day as well, but the more kind of lower status communities within the Herefordshire landscape. So if we look at the design landscape around Wigmore, we have a deer park here, and we have a large deer park here. And we see how the isochrones, the time bunches up in these deer parks because they're harder to move across, they're hilly areas. And we also have our Pleasance over here. So at Wigmore, we have our designed leisurely landscape across a massive area of the Herefordshire landscape. And furthermore, they were to be moving across it in horses, on horses, not in horses. That would be very strange. And that kind of it condenses time. It creates a different interpretation of the landscape. So this is based on walking. But if you're moving with your horse, you think of everything differently. It condenses your travel time. And it shows, it's kind of a very visual display that time is a luxury that belonged particularly to elite individuals and the elite holders of the castles. Because in comparison, our everyday community, our lower status community who might have to travel through the deer park for work, for instance, for looking after woodland management, it would be strenuous for them. It's hard walking, it's hard hills. But for the elite community on their horses, everything is distinctly different. They experience time in a different way in this landscape, and they show it through ensuring that their leisurely activities spread out as far as possible and demonstrating that time is for them a luxury around the castles. So that is the end. I've got some further readings here, some of the most important points, and do let me know if you have any questions. And if you want to contact me, just send me a message on here and I'll leave my email on.
Excellent. I think I will definitely need that slide, especially at the end there. Thank you. Very interesting talk. So if you could, again, stop screen sharing. Finally, we have Alison Norton, who will be talking about Anglo-Norman castles in southwest England. Over to you, Alison.
Just to go on Arthur's point, who doesn't love a good mound? You're about to see some real good ones. Let me share my screen real quick. Awesome. Right. So, hi, I'm Alison Norton. I'm a PhD candidate at Canterbury Christ Church University. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my research and give a general overview of what I'm looking at, its context, its importance, some of my methodology, and the obstacles I anticipate facing, because my research is very much in its early stages. So let's keep that in mind. But my research stems from my previous work I did for my MPhil at the University of Exeter, where I used digital techniques like GIS and LiDAR to help widen our understanding of sighting patterns and castle classifications in rural Devon. So the picture we see here is Wimworthy. It's just a little north of Exeter. It was one of my case studies. Lovely mound. So while conducting my research, I noticed specific patterns within the field, both in approaches and geographic scopes. For example, studies in understanding the intent behind using castles to promote individual lordly identities usually take an anecdotal approach to emphasize a castle's significance as a center of political and administrative power. In some cases, studies have been chosen based on ample surviving material and textual evidence, while others are overlooked because of their absence. In addition, though these studies investigate individual sites, castles have generally been viewed collectively to ascertain broad typologies rather than to understand individual sites. With regards to geographic patterns, our understanding of the Southwest primarily stemmed from Hyam's work on Devon and Pryor's research on Somerset. And Hyam's research has served as a platform for studies regarding castles in the medieval Devon landscape. And though both have provided foundational research for the Southwest, approaches still remained anecdotal. For example, studies in Devon predominantly are focused on Exeter and Okehampton, which creates a fragmented analysis for the overall county, where my research comes in. So my research investigates why castle builders in the medieval southwest of England chose specific sites, and how castle lords utilized local landscapes and castle design to project lordly identities between 1050 and 1215. This range was specifically chosen because it denotes the start of Norman castle building in England and ends with the decline of timber castles. Post 1215, we gradually see castles moving from timber to masonry with few new builds occurring, and that's just a general overview of the patterns we see at the time, not specifically within the Southwest. So to help address the previously mentioned gaps in research, my project looks at the less well-known sites that have little or no documentation associated with their historical or archaeological context. And by framing a new research agenda around these lesser sites, or background noise as they're sometimes called, we can create a new agenda that looks just sort of break past those patterns that we see and typically prescribed to castles in general, and can go a little bit more into the locally based landscape itself. Now, to investigate these ideologies of identity, it is crucial to apply an interdisciplinary methodological approach through the integration of historical sources revolving around charters, manuscripts, sermons, and chronicles, to just name a few. Perceptions of castles can be constructed. These perceptions can then be coupled with archaeological analysis of the medieval landscape, specifically looking at how the landscape evolved from the Anglo-Saxon, and how Normans utilized the environment when making decisions regarding siting. With both the historical and archaeological context in place, my research will apply a series of intensive GIS and LiDAR analyses to reveal how lords visually projected these identities within the landscape, which I will touch a bit more on in later slides. And finally, I am conducting a regional study of the Southwest. We have seen how regional studies allow for a wider analysis of siting motives and how they help enhance our understanding of early castles from various dimensions, such as structure, architecture, landscape position, provisioning, etc. My previous research focused on Devon, given it was considered the main administrative unit of the medieval Southwest. I'm doing a comparative study between Devon and Dorset, essentially seeking to see how widespread sociocultural ideologies were, and looking at were there regional patterns of castle siting, function, and general ideas of the castle itself, or do they only exist within certain counties? To help explore these, I have constructed 3 questions with specific methodologies. As we can see, my first question addresses the landscape component, whereby I'm looking at the extent decisions had regarding the location and form of castles, how they projected lord identity in the southwest of England, which I then expand to the projection of identity to see if it changes between 1050 and 1215. So here I'm looking at how the inclusion of castles impacted the local or the county-based and the regional landscape. I also want to assess how Normans were influenced by the landscape itself. So in addition to various secondary readings on the medieval Southwest landscape, I will look at and create distribution maps and geological maps, while also running statistical analyses to test if sighting patterns do occur. For example, looking at, are castles predominantly located along rivers? Are they more often sited within river bends or close to fords? Are they located near certain building materials? All these patterns that we typically read about and sort of prescribe to castles within the medieval landscape throughout England. I then need to see if my results support or contradict those typically believed patterns. And from this question, we can, or I can, see the evolution of the land, how the landscape unfolds, allowing me to analyze how the landscape and identity are interconnected. My second question will address the historical sources, specifically chronicles and chroniclers. So the reason being is because we have numerous chroniclers depicting castles and their landscapes. For example, Warwick, Monmouth, Malmesbury, Isildur. Some of them have already been touched on in previous talks, so I won't go too much into them. But why are they assigning this term to certain structures? You know, what influences them? We know there are various words they could and did use to in place of the castle. So why did they choose to prescribe this word to certain structures? You know, why this classification? Did they fit a specific design, function, or landscape? And did this image they constructed alongside the term resonate with their audiences? Now, to my great shame, I do not have a TARDIS, nor do I have access to one. So there's that. But what I can do is create a comprehensible analysis of the above questions by also including a wide array of literature like we saw with Wheatley's work. And from there, patterns in theory should begin to emerge throughout these sources, and the likelihood of audiences understanding them should be high. So my research would then move to my final question. And my research will then look at visibility within the landscape. Now, GIS studies in the past have addressed how visibility within the landscape influenced sighting patterns, which we've seen in Swallows, Lowry's, and Magnet McKieran's respective works. And from them, I will build upon their ideas of reflective and projective views, which are typically discussed in studies pertaining to visibility. However, I will also incorporate human and cultural geography theories. This allows me to understand elements of visibility, such as accessibility, movement, and connectivity. The theory being, does movement make something visible? If something is visible, does it have to be accessible? And how does something being visibly connected to another object influence a place's social or cultural place or space? To explore these questions, I will construct various visual and spatial analyses through GIS and LiDAR. Now, my case studies have not been finalized. Thank you, COVID, for the new variant. So they're all on private land. They were going to be finalized until then, so I unfortunately do not have anything to show you in that respect. So what I did, just to help provide you with essentially what I plan on doing, this is Eggesford. It's a motte and bailey just north of Exeter. It actually sits 500 meters to the southwest of Wimworthy. So I looked at them as a unit to see why they were sited where they were. This will just give you an idea of the 3D LiDAR models that I plan on constructing to help me with site typology, to help assess existing earthworks, to see what we can actually see. You know, though it's labeled as a motte and bailey, do we actually see a motte and bailey? Stuff like that. It also helps to remove any of the vegetation or sort of hindrances that we see with the modern builds, like new modern buildings with brick, or in some of my old cases, there were a lot of horse farms that I had to sort of do away with. So never a dull moment. And because no research is without its obstacles, I do anticipate on facing a few. I can already see the questions forming in your head. So one of the main ones would be LiDAR availability. If anyone's ever had to do LiDAR in the Southwest, you know how patchy it is and how completely at the mercy of DEFRA and Digimap I will be. So in terms of coverage and in terms of the availability, I have to strategically choose which sites I look at. And on the topic of the site itself, I will need to assess the quality of surviving earthworks. Basically, are they there? Sometimes they're not. We've all faced similar issues when it comes to remnants of our case studies. For me, my sites will have undergone numerous years, centuries, if even, of being subjected to plowing and erosion. Yet their immediate landscape cannot be completely urbanized, nor can the earthwork be completely gone. It'll be near impossible for me to do any GIS or LiDAR work if that happens. So it has to be as rural or as untouched, if that's the right word, as possible, just to kind of not hinder the analysis even further. So yes, having the area remain rural helps in trying to work backwards in terms of piecing together how the environments have changed. We also have the terminological and representation to overcome. So here we see the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which I'm currently looking at right now, along with the Bayeux Tapestry. Now in this excerpt, a couple of castles are named, and they are classified as castles. We have Tunbridge and we have Pevensey. But unfortunately, we don't have much else aside from that. But even though there is no mention of design and function, what we do have is the chronicler saying these are castles. We're classifying them as castle, and we're giving them the classification as Norman. So calling this a Norman structure is just to help audiences distinguish between English structures and castles. Is being Norman, according to the chronicler, what makes these structures specifically castles? And then to echo that, in the tapestry, the only time a variation of the word castle is used is in reference to the construction of Hastings Castle. And we see Hastings depicted as a tower-esque structure atop a man-made mound, yet similar structures can be found throughout the tapestry. So did the word castle need to be used to also signify to the Norman audiences that this structure is a castle, even though it's in England? You know, is that the main signifier? It has to be Norman. The design and function, to kind of go off what Heidi was saying, can be in variation, can be in flux, and can be very fluid as long as the original site is Norman. I am undergoing a lot more analysis of chronicles and primary source material at the moment, so I'm not going to say what my conclusion is. We must watch this space for that. So yes, I do think that is the main thing that constitutes a castle, is being Norman, as it were. But then we have the landscape being what it is. Now, to say with complete accuracy that this is how the medieval landscape would have looked during this specific time, here we go, it's just impossible. You can't say with complete accuracy because, you know, change is inevitable. So how will I determine the borders to use when focusing on control and influence certain sites would have had? And thankfully, UCL has conducted the Anglo-Saxon Atlas project. Yay! And they've created shapefiles of Domesday hundreds and medieval bridges. So at the very least, I can work with these early boundaries as a means of defining a castle's wider landscape and use bridges to determine communication and trade routes, should the site suggest the castle is somehow connected to a nearby river, like we see with my earlier case studies, Winworthy and Eggesford. You have the Taw right here. So the main theory is they were sited to control trade and communication, given a market town is just north of it in Chumley. With these shapefiles, you can test that and you can add a little bit more concentration to your GIS and LiDAR analyses. So thankfully, I get to do that. But yes. Now, with landscapes being a fluid factor in analysis, there is the age-old question, will GIS be helpful? Just because you create a map doesn't mean it tells you anything. I've been told that numerous times by students, so that's something to keep in mind. But I am working on ways to overcome that. I think I have come up with a solution where point cloud data will help me erase some of the modern features. For example, if you were to do view sheds or cost path analysis with modern roads, typically follow that. And with view sheds within Wimworthy and Eggesford, they tended to follow the rail, the train line that's going right through it. And we also have to overcome Victorian forests such as Haywood Forest here. But as I said, I need to test them out first on my case studies before I'll say that they're actually working, that they're way forward, just in case those sitting on the edge of their seats like, tell me how you do the GIS. Get me in a couple months and I'll let you know. But then last but not least, there is the wonderful question of what is a castle? I know Heidi's touched on this. And the moment she did, I thought, no, you've stolen it. But here we go. So it's combating the various ideas about a castle. Now, thankfully, I don't see ecclesiastical or mythological ideas playing a huge role in my research, as we see with the Castle of Love from the Luttrell Psalter, or the Arthurian legends of Tintagel, which is in Cornwall. So that does help provide a little bit more focus to me. But then we also have places like Totnes, with shell keeps to consider. We have this that started out with stone. To quote people who, when I say I study castles and they actually see the sites that I study, they go, it's just a hill. Which really is just so sweet to go in a Hallmark card. But you know, whose idea am I playing with? Am I going with us as academics? Am I going with people that were actually writing the chronicles? So it's really difficult to say it's going to be these ideas, everything else goes away, because we don't really know when certain words started being used. We see the first time they're written. We can't say for certain if they were used prior to that, or even how widespread that term was at the time we see it documented. But yes, this is sort of like, I know that was sort of fast and little, but I think people would appreciate that right now because it might be dinner time. So yes, that is essentially things that I'm looking at, things that I'm exploring in my 3-year plan. So we know I'm going to just be loving this. So yes, that's me, that's my project. And yes, thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think that's, yeah, a very, very interesting subject. Interesting to see that what is a castle crops up in a couple of places there, and an excellent trio of talks there. So what comes next is we will have a bit of time for questions from the audience. We'll take a moment to thank our speakers after that, and then maybe a couple of words from Gillian. So I'll start by stopping the record.